Hello fiber friends, welcome to another little kit video here, and if you don't have the kit you're more than welcome to follow along with your own wool at home. But my name is Melissa. I am the artist behind Wishless World Felted Fiber Arts, and today we're going to be making a little panda bear. And as you can kind of see, he's got a teddy bear kind of shape. And once you kind of learn to do it once, you can apply that to other animals. You could do a standard teddy bear. This one has a bit of a pink nose, so he's kind of almost more mouse-like. But yeah, the teddy bear shape is just useful because you kind of just swap out the ears and you've got a whole nother animal. So let's take a look inside the kit now. And this will be sort of a shopping list for those of you who don't have the kit. If you want to buy the kit, I'll link my Etsy shop down below. But in the meantime, we've got some black wool. This is technically a core wool from Serafina Fiber Arts. And then we have some regular core wool. This is the uncolored sort of off-white core wool you'll find pretty much everywhere. My favorite version of it comes from livingfelt.com. I'm not affiliated with either store. That's just where I tend to shop from. And then we have a snazzy little template. We'll learn how to use that later. We have a bunch of fun little supplies in here. You'll notice there's some more white. If you got really close up to it, you can kind of see, maybe the camera can see, I can tell from my position that this is a lot more yellow. This is a processed white, so it has some brighteners in it. And so I like to use it for the surface of our panda to kind of give them just a little bit more contrast. So leave that in the bag, try not to lose it. And speaking of try not to lose, there's some eyes floating around in the bottom there, right? Leave those alone for the time being. All you really need to start with is your little vial of needles. And then last but not least, our felting pad. This one is exactly the size of the box. Future kits might have a slightly smaller one. It just kind of depends on the ebb and flow of my supply chain. Now, before we get to all the fun felting, let's go ahead and go over our safety real quick because we are using needles today. They are quite stabby. And the first bit of advice that I will give you is that to always park your needles in your foam pad, right? If they're like this, then the sharp side is always down, and even if you knock into them, you're not really going to hurt yourself. If you get in the habit of leaving your needles on here or even down here, I have seen it before where someone will like kind of brush against it and there'll be something, if you brush against it and then there's something right here, you could end up stabbing yourself with it there. But I find more what is the problem is that they get knocked off the table or whatever surface you're using, and then you've got a very sharp thing that you have to go find, and that's no fun. Next safety tip is that when you're stabbing with your needle, you want to stab in and out at the same angle. So if you're going in at a 45, come out at a 45, and then you can move the needle around. What you'll find is that you can kind of twist the needle while it's in your project, but that will start to wear out the needle. Think of a wire or something that you've bent too many times, it could snap. And it's really no fun to go try to fish out the tip of a needle from inside your project. And then last but not least, when you're working, always work down into the mat, right? Mat is a nice barrier between you and the table. A lot of people want to bring this up and look at it up close, and I might end up doing that just for the sake of showing you details. But work down on the mat, because what happens when you get really energetic and you're working with this in your hand? Look at that. Look at how easily the needle goes all the way through our project, right? So yes. Work down in the mat and, try to keep your fingers away from where you're stabbing. I know that seems like pretty basic advice, but people do have to learn how to do that because it's natural to want to kind of hold it tightly right where you're working. That's just human nature, right? Now that we've got our safety out of the way, let's go ahead and take a real quick look at our needles here. Your kit will have two types of felting needles. There's one with a green top here. That one is a 40 twist, and you don't really have to remember that, but what is good to know is that this is our finer needle. It will create a smaller hole. It doesn't grab as much wool. It's easier to move in and out of the project, and honestly, I use this like 90% of the time. It's my go-to needle. You can kind of think of it if you've ever like watched artists who draw in pencil. There's the artist who like uses a mechanical pencil pretty much the whole way through, right? And then you have other artists who actually use, 6H all the way to 6B. Felty needles are kind of the same way. There are so many out there. But this kit has, a good starter range. Our other needle is the red needle, and this is a 36 star. It's a much more stout, sturdy needle. You can kind of compare the edges on the two. This one has a very fine edge, and it's beveled, and it twists around, whereas this one is more like spokes. That's how you get your star shape. For most people, this is sort of your workhorse needle, your building structure needle. It's really good at moving a lot of wool, relative for a felty needle anyways. It'll make a much bigger indent into your project. It'll grab more wool, like I said, and there are uses for this one. But I don't use it most of the time because I'd rather build up a lot of little holes than have really big holes, unless I'm trying to intentionally make a dimple or an eye socket or something of that nature. Now, something that's not included in your kit, but I will be using today, are some felting handles. Now, if you just have the kit, you don't have the handles, these needles are pretty easy to use. You're going to kind of want to grab it right about there, and then you're going to use your, I guess, is that your index finger or your pointer finger? Your pointer finger, to sort of brace against the tip or the curved part here, the flat part, and that's how you'll hold it. And if you're just starting out, you're only making like one project for a whole week, holding the needle this way is fine. You might get a little sore at the end just because you're not used to it, but it's fine. However, I felt a lot. Often many projects in one day, if not, many projects in 1 week. And I have to worry about carpal tunnel. So having a bigger thing to grab helps. But even more importantly, when I'm making a video, they're color coordinated here. So my green needle will go in the green handle and the red needle will go in the red handle. And that'll make it a lot easier for you guys to follow along and kind of know what I'm using. And just keep in mind that how I use the needles, like when I use which needle, is sort of a matter of personal preference. I'll try to, if it seems relevant, explain why I've switched the needles, but overall, you just get a feel for it. I like the thin needle, and it does take more stabs to work with the thin needle if you do that exclusively, but to each their own. And with all of that out of the way, we can actually start working on our project. Yay! I want you to go ahead and grab out your white core wool here, whatever shape it may be in. You may have a few smaller strips than this, maybe shorter ones or at least thinner ones. It comes in a kind of they call it roving, sort of like a ball, twisty ball, and some areas of it are thicker and some areas are thinner. That's just the way of the beast. But we're going to kind of pare it down into small strips like this. They can be longer, but the idea is that the width, no more than an inch, anywhere from like half an inch to an inch in width is a good idea. And the way we want to split this out is we want to start by splitting it in half. And I like to go not only in the middle this way, but in the middle that way too, lengthwise and widthwise. And I just kind of work it until I can get some fingers through and tear. By working straight in the middle, it helps these pieces stay sort of in a consistent size. And I'm going to go ahead and split this one again. And I could almost split this one another time. I think I'll leave it alone. So you'll have at least 4 pieces, but if yours is still looking pretty fat, you know, more than an inch on the width, then like right up here, this is pretty fat. Just keep tearing until you kind of get some nice strips going. And the first thing we're going to work on is the base of the body and the base of the head. And that's where our handy dandy little template is going to come in handy. The handy dandy template comes in handy. That's great. We're going to wrap balls, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. But we're going to wrap balls, and we're going to try to wrap a ball that's a little bit bigger than this one and a little bit bigger than this one. So for example, here's one that's wrapped, but it hasn't been fully felted yet. It's a bit bigger than the template. But if I keep poking it a lot, like so, eventually it's going to shrink down and it's going to smooth out like this one. This is my head ball here. And after I keep poking it and it shrinks down, hopefully it'll be about the size of the template. You know, if yours is still a little bit larger, it's not going to be the end of the world, but it shouldn't be too much larger than the template when you're all done with it. So let's get started. What we're going to do is we're going to grab one of our strips. It doesn't matter which one. If you have like longer pieces and shorter pieces, if you have longer pieces, start with those first. That's usually my preference. And we're going to make a knot in our wool here, right in the center if you can. And I wrapped it around my fingers, I pushed it through, and voila, a nice little knot. And you'll pull this fairly tight. You'll start to notice when you're pulling too hard because the wool itself will start to separate. You know, stop before you tear the wool. But we have a nice solid core here, a center for our project. And the reason why we like that is that now we have a nice little dense spot in the middle. And the way felting works, basically, I could go into real depth, but the real simple explanation is that all these little fibers, all this hair, has little tiny scales on it, kind of like Pantene shampoo commercial. You've seen like split ends and all the little curly cues and stuff. That's what makes felting happen. Sheep's wool has a lot of those little scales on it, and when they rub up against each other, they start to interlock and, you know, stick like Velcro. So if we have a nice dense center, as we're poking our wool in, there's a nice area where there's so many fibers that it's more likely that the fibers we're pushing in will have something to connect to. Anyways, now that we have our knot, we're going to take one of the tails, doesn't matter which one, and we're going to wrap it in one direction. And then we're going to tack it down, which just means give it a couple of light pokes. I'm using my light needle, the green needle for this, and it doesn't take much, and you'll see that now this doesn't want to unravel. It's not fully felted yet, but it's sticking together, which is sort of the first step to felting something, right? And then we're going to take our other tail and we're going to wrap this one as well, just in the opposite direction, just sort of encourage an even, close to a ball-like shape. Now that that's there, I might give it a few pokes sort of around the really loose ends, making sure to keep my fingers away from the needle and also to rotate my project. The more I move around this sphere, the more it'll stay a sphere. If you sort of attack your ball all from one side, it'll start to flatten out and it won't be, you know, a nice round shape anymore. You don't have to go too crazy. This one's a little on the dense side, but not too bad. And we're going to go ahead and wrap again, because if I compare it to my, let's say I'm trying to aim for a head size, that fits in my template already and we haven't really felted it. So we're going to want to add another layer, and maybe not even a whole one of these. You can always sort of adjust how much you're using. You may not use all of the core wool in your kit. I try to add extra because it's, I measure by the 1/10 of a gram and sometimes it's still just a bit off. And anyways, after you've gotten that first knot in there, you can just keep adding strips until you're satisfied with it, so to speak. I've added that one, I've tacked it down, and I'll compare it to my template again. And yeah, that one's a little bit bigger than the template, and this seems actually a really good size here. So right now, it's a bit bigger, right? But it's also very loose. This is dense. This is like if you cook a steak to well done, it's kind of got that like firm, a little bit of spring, but pretty firm texture. That's sort of your end goal. Whereas this one right here has not been felted, or this one even. And so there's some loose parts that squish before I get to the center. So with this one, again, it's a little bit bigger than my template, but not by a lot, just a little bit. We're going to go ahead and poke all the way around it. And you'll do this with both of your balls, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm giving this some pokes, and I'll edit out some of the poking because it can be a bit repetitive, right? Don't want to bore you guys on the tutorial here. But this was the same one that was bigger than our template. And I probably could poke it even more than this, but let's check. Oh, yep, now it can pass through our template. So you see, it shrinks quite a bit once you start to felt it. And remember, our goal is sort of that like well done steak kind of consistency. If you've never poked your steak before, you can also sort of put your 2 fingers together here like an OK sign and feel right where this tenon meets. It has sort of a stiffness to it, but also bounce. That's a similar sort of texture too. So we are now at the pause screen. Go ahead and make both of your balls. Make your head size ball and your body size ball, and I will see you in just a little bit. Welcome back. Now that you have your 2 balls, your head ball and your body ball there, if you have any leftover core wool, go ahead and just set that aside. Who knows, maybe it'll be enough for you to make a little tiny miniature polar bear, teddy bear type situation, right? We're gonna go ahead now that all that core wool is out of the way, grab our nice brighter white wool. Now if this just feels like an extra step to you, you don't have to do it. Like I said, I enjoy adding that bit more white feel to it. The yellow wool works just fine, but I don't know. You do this long enough and you can kind of notice when it's only core wool. Plus, I didn't really talk about this before. I've done that in other videos, but core wool has a lot of little sticks and stuff in it. And I always just leave those alone because I assume I'm going to cover it up with something. So that's another reason to get out our nice good white. Now we are going to need a little bit of the white for this muzzle. So if you'd like to, you can kind of reserve a bit off to the side. This might be too much, but you know, tear off a chunk and tell yourself that do not use until later. And then with the rest of it, what I typically do, because we only really need a really thin layer to cover this with, is I'll sort of split this in half, kind of like tearing a 2-ply paper towel, right? And just kind of go right down the center there. And this makes some nice, really thin pieces to work with. And all we're going to do is we're going to take our nice good white and cover our balls. So I added some in, and then I'm going to poke it back down. And that's pretty straightforward. I think you can kind of figure that out. So I'm going to set up the pause button, and you can decide whether or not you're going to cover your project with the other white, or if you're just ready to move on to the next step. All right, now both of my balls are covered in the quote-unquote good white, right? The more expensive processed white. And I have felted them enough that they're close. They're not exactly as small as they were before, but they're close to the size that they were before I added the good white. And that's the fun thing about wool, is that if you poke it enough, it usually shrinks, although there is a limit to all things. Like this one got a bit chunky. But anyways, I have both of my balls. They're covered. Yours may not be covered if you decided to skip that step. But now it's time to attach them. And usually I would just kind of hold them like this and attach that way, but you can end up poking yourself. So it might behoove of you to use your straight pins to just kind of give it a little extra holding power, right? Because now that ball is staying on top there and I can kind of work with it without having all of my fingers next to the needle, right? And when we attach, I'm going to go, let's say, from the head to the body. I'm going to rotate it around and go all the way through. And after I make one pass, I'm going to want to switch it up and go from the body into the head. Because if we can kind of crisscross those connections, they'll become stronger than if we do it all from one direction. So I'm just going to go back and forth, maybe kind of put it up. And what's good about changing the angle, right? Like I sat my little guy upwards. This is giving me a more strong angle than when it was down here and I was kind of doing a bit of a shallower angle. Variety is the spice of life, and it is also the way to make really good felting connections. You want to go from all directions if you can. And after you give it a little bit, like I haven't been at this for very long, maybe 30 seconds, you'll see that you can kind of take this out. And this one's pretty well stuck on. I find that there's one little loose bit here, so I'm going to work on just that one corner a little extra. But for the most part, the head is staying on the body. No losing our head today. And our next step is going to be to make the legs and the arms here. We're going to do that first before we worry about all the little details like his shoulder stripe here and the ears, because those arms and legs are a lot easier to make with, let's say, fresh wool, stuff that you haven't overly broken down yet. So depending on your kit, there may be a lot of pieces, there may be one really big piece, but what we want to sort of aim for is we want to break it down into strips that are a bit shorter than this little armhole right here. So this one is a bit longer than that armhole, so I'm going to want this to be more narrow. So I'm going to pull off a little bit, kind of the same way we had trimmed our core wool before, but I'm not going straight through the middle. I only want to get a little bit off the edge. I'm also going to kind of feel this for any really thick spots. This type of wool can often have like a random sort of knot in it. Not really a knot, but a dense area. So I'm going to kind of tease it, pull it a little bit. When you pull roving like this, it's technically called drafting. That's a term you'll hear more with spinners, right? People who make yarn and whatnot than felters, but it's still a term there. So there, we have a nice strip, and you can kind of edit all of your strips to be like that all at once, or you can work with one strip at a time and you know, do it as you go, right? And what I want to do, now that I have this here, so this is right now, you know, at its thickest, it's maybe as wide, but there's like a kind of a loose end, so it's not quite as wide until we get to about there, as our little example in the template here, right? So that's where we want to be. And how we want to make these legs is we are going to sort of roll, like give it a couple of little rolls, and then on one end, you're going to want to fold up. And the reason for that is twofold. Kind of a pun there. But anyways, when I started to roll this, even though it was not as wide as this thing was, look at that, it's already gotten thicker. It's a weird little dynamic thing that wool does when you start to roll it, is it sort of squishes out, like if you had jam in a jelly roll, right? So this is getting longer than what we started with. But also, we want the tip of the arms here and the feet here to be nice and dense, but we want the side that connects to the body to be a little loose. So adding one fold to just a single side, you're not going to fold the other side, will help kind of make one end denser. And that's going to be our hand end or our feet end. And you're just going to keep rolling it until it's, about as wide as this, maybe just a tiny bit wider because it'll shrink when it gets felted. And with all the extra, you're just going to lightly tear that apart and fold that in. And when you're felting this, I'm still using my green needle. I very rarely use my red needle, but I'm going to go all the way around, and I'm going to keep moving my project, right? And I apologize if the sort of black on gray is hard to see here. I'll have to get a different example pad. In fact, I can do that. So this is actually the felting pad I use most of the time. When you felt a lot, you want something really sturdy. These are great for like your first 100 projects or so. Maybe only 50. But for a beginner, these are fantastic. They're lightweight, they're inexpensive, they're nice and flat, which this one used to be flat, but I've used it so much that it's not flat anymore. But eventually, if you do a lot of felting, you're going to upgrade your pad, probably. But I'm only bringing it out because it gives me some better contrast with the black. You can see it's pretty dirty. That's what happens when you use a pad a lot. It starts to pick up wool. But I am going to keep poking and turning and poking and turning. And I'll even poke it from the harder end back towards itself. But the really loose end, you can kind of see how it's a little bit transparent at the very end there. I really don't want to overly work that part. And the reason for that is that when we attach all the little feet and arms to our project, we're going to use the loose end, and the loose end will work better because it is loose. It can kind of go into the body and connect with those. Whereas when it's super felted, those fibers don't want to go anywhere. They've already been felted. You can only get so much connection out of one thread, right? So your next task is to make 4 roughly equivalent little pieces. And mine ended up being a bit long, but that's okay. If they're super long, you can kind of tear a bit off of the end. I'm not going to worry too much about this one because when we get to the bottom, I can kind of just put all the extra in his butt. But anyways, go ahead and make 4 of those and pause the video, and we'll see each other in just a little bit. Welcome back. I have my 4 legs and arms. They're all relatively close in size, but if you find that you have some size variance, pick out your 2 smallest, and that usually ends up being my arms, and my 2 longest end up being my legs. But before we attach those, We're going to go ahead and deal with this collar now. We didn't do that before just because we wanted to use the biggest pieces we could to help make the legs and everything consistent. But now with one of my leftover scraps, I can go ahead and grab a little bit out. And I just want a thin little layer. So I don't think I'm going to split this again, but I'm just going to kind of pull it to make it a little thinner here. Just like so. And right at where I guess the neck would be, there's really no neck on these. That's not the way they're designed, but right about there. I'm gonna sort of poke one end in, give it a couple of pokes, and then I should be able to kind of wrap it a bit. Might have to give it a couple of extra pokes here just to make sure it doesn't slip off. And when I get to the end of the neck, I'll tear off. If your piece was so short, you know, that you needed another piece, then that might also be a valid tactic. But either way, just use as much as you need. And I'm going to poke that all in. And that gives me a nice little collar going on. Because pandas have a bit of black right below their neck and along their shoulders. And after I poke that all in, I am ready to attach our arms and legs. So I think I decided, are these the short ones? Yeah, we'll say these are the short ones. Now, the positioning of the arms are kind of up to you. If they're like down, I think that's sort of a more standard teddy bear pose, but you could also put them up in kind of like a hug me pose, right? And if you want to play around with that idea, you can always take one of your straight pins and sort of make a temporary joint, right? And now I can kind of move this around and, I don't know, see where I want it to be, right? I think I kind of like the arms up in a huggy pose today, so I'm gonna attach them right there. And attaching them is pretty straightforward. I can leave those straight pins while I kind of solidify the connection, but I'm using my green needle yet again. This project is almost all green needle. But I'm going through the arm and into the shoulder. You want to make sure that those fibers actually connect in. And again, we're putting the loose end there because the loose end will sort of merge with our already felted ball a bit better than if it was a very dense end. And after I think the connection is secure enough, go ahead and take those straight pins out because they can kind of get in the way. And then I'm going to make sure I work it from all angles, just like before, right? And this could use some more felting, but I'll go ahead and show you the legs real quick so you can do this all on your own pace. Legs are a similar situation. If you really want to play with it, you can straight pin them in. I think pretty much all the time I want my legs to be in sort of a V shape, you know, with that nice little spoot going on. So they're going to be right there. And I'm just going to attach them to the body. This is all pretty straightforward now that you guys kind of get the idea, right? So go ahead and pause the video and attach your arms and legs. All right, now I have my arms and my legs attached, and hopefully you do too. I think next up we're going to go ahead and work on those cute little ears. And to do that, I'm going to pull out my template once again, and we're going to use this more like a stencil this time. I'm going to lay it down. This is where having a nice flat surface is helpful, because this would be better on here, but for contrast's sake, you know what? I'll go on this one. I'm a maverick. Do what I want. All right. So lay down your template, and you're going to grab some of that black that hopefully you have left over. And we're going to grab out a piece that's maybe let's say about the size of the first knuckle of my thumb. And it's not a very thick piece. Like you can kind of see bits of my hand through there, kind of shine light through it, right? Not a very giant piece at all. And I'm going to go ahead and lay it right over this template and pull out that white hair there. And I'm going to poke kind of just all around in there, trying to not poke through the cardboard. And we don't need to do a lot, like this maybe 20 pokes right there. And then what I want to do is I want to fold all of this stuff on the curvy end back in, and I want to leave the flat end kind of loose. So that's going to look a bit like this. Just like with the arms and the legs, if we have an area that is thinner, kind of looser, it'll connect better to the overall body, right? And be careful not to give this too many pokes to start with. It's very tempting to just keep working and refining the shape, but it'll get stuck to your felting surface, whether that's a styrofoam mat or if it's a fabric one. So at a certain point, once you've gotten everything folded in, you're going to kind of want to take the template off, and you're going to want to very gently remove this from the mat because it'll try to stick. Flip it over and work on it from the other side. You know, just kind of tightening it up in, give it a few pokes, lift it up, and you'll see just by giving it some pokes, even though it started off much bigger than my template, it's actually ending up being a bit smaller than it now. After I've worked it from both sides, I'm going to work it again from one side, but this time I'm going to kind of tilt it upwards, and that'll help encourage a very slight curve in it. We'll just make it look a little more appealing once we attach it to our panda. Just like so. Voila. So go ahead and make yourself 2 ears, and we'll attach it in just a second. Now that I have both of my ears, I'm going to kind of do the same thing I did with the arms. I'm going to use my straight pins to kind of figure out where I want those ears to be. I find that typically it looks a little cuter if they're a bit lower on the head than my natural impulse is to go first. Like I always want to put ears like way up here, but that's not a very good panda shape, right? They have tiny ears and they're kind of off to the side a little bit. Once I kind of play with that and figure out where they need to be, then we're just going to attach them. This is all pretty straightforward at this point. You may find, what I do find with ears sometimes is that they're thin in the middle. So sometimes I'll pull off a little bit of extra black and kind of go on the back side and just kind of thicken up where it meets the body and give it a little bit of extra connection and strength. Especially if you think someone small might try to pick this up, right? Felting is not as sturdy as some stuffed animals can be. But yeah, go ahead and attach both of your ears, and we'll talk again in just a few minutes. Both my ears are on, so now I'm going to work on the muzzle, and I'm going to grab that piece of white that I saved earlier, and it's definitely going to be a lot of white. I'm going to tear off a piece that's, how big is this? A little bit more than 1 inch by 1 inch. And this will, you know, how big this needs to be will kind of depend on how thick that little bit of white has been. But I'm just going to go ahead and fold it over and kind of roll it up into roughly an oval kind of a shape, like so. And I'll further kind of edit that shape while it's down here on my mat. And I don't need to make it super firm. I just want to kind of round it out and thicken it up a little bit before I attach it to the head. So maybe right about there-ish. We'll go right in the center of the head here. And we'll go all the way around. You can use your straight pins if you're worried about poking yourself. I've done this particular operation often enough that I'm not too worried for my own hands, but you can always be cautious if you want to. And voila, we have the beginnings of our nose going on right there, right? Just a little mound in the center of the face. We're going to take some black that was left over, and I'm going to make this thinner than it is here. It's maybe like 1/4 inch or so in thickness. And I'm just going to do what's called a pinch and roll. And I'll move this so you get full contrast here. I'm going to kind of fold it and pinch it and fold it again. So pinch and roll is how I've heard it described. And you just want to go, you know, until you know how big your muzzle is. So you want to make something that's maybe about 2/3 of the size of your muzzle. So I'm going to tear off the extra here, kind of wrap that in. And just like with the muzzle, I'm going to want to get it a little firm, kind of make it a bit more solid down here on the mat before I transfer it to my main project here. So just firming it up a little bit. If you don't take the time to do that, it'll kind of flatten out on your piece because it's soft, right? So if you're only poking it from one direction, then that's the direction it flattens in. So I'm going to put this right on the muzzle, kind of on the top half of the muzzle. It's a little hard to see on the camera because the contrast isn't that great, but basically the top half of the mound that we added earlier is where I'm going to put the nose. And just poke, 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 poke. And voila. We're almost at the end already, guys. This was an easy project, wasn't it? For felting. If you've never done it before, this is a relatively easy project. But anyways, go ahead and get that nose on there, and we'll add on our eyes next. Now that you've got that nose on there nice and firm, we're going to finally add the eyes that have been hiding in our bag and hopefully not getting lost or falling onto the floor. And it doesn't matter how long the little eye shafts are. Sometimes they just come out longer than others. That's not going to hurt anything. I had an in-person class student ask me if it mattered, and it does not. I mean, the really short ones are hard to work with, but overall it doesn't make too much of a difference. And you know, just like before, if you want to, you can kind of plan ahead where those eyes should go by sort of putting some straight pins in, and you can play with the position. Like, do you want them like up high? This would be more of a cartoony, like an American cartoony eye position. If you want to go more cutesy, maybe even anime-ish eyes, they'd be more right about here. And this is probably closer to where they are on a real panda bear anyways. So I think that's where I'm going to aim for. Go ahead and pull those out now that I have a good idea of where the eyes go. And I'm going to take the red needle. I'm finally intentionally using the red needle, you guys. And right where I think I wanted that eye, I'm going to poke in kind of a few small jabs at first, and then I really want to poke way down. And because this needle is thicker, it's going to create sort of a little tunnel in our wool, right? A little shaft that the post of our eyeball can just sort of slip into, like so. Isn't that lovely? That was so cute. They're cuter without the little eye patches, but it's not a true panda unless we add the eye patches. So I make another little hole and I add that in. Once the eyes are there, now we're going to make little eye patches, like I said. I find that it's easier because it's sort of like a kidney bean shape. I find it easier to break it down into two parts. So I'm going to make a circle kind of up high and a circle kind of down low. And the way I do that is I tear a tiny bit off. This is like, it's less than a thumbnail's worth, although I guess it overlaps my thumbnail a little bit. But this is just teeny tiny amount of black, right? And I'm going to put it up by my eye. And I'm just going to poke it in sort of around where the eye is. And sort of just go back and forth. And that'll round it out. And then for the bottom of the eye, I'm going to take another teeny tiny bit, right? About thumbnail size, I suppose. And now we're going to go below the eye. And we're just going to make a circle right there. And that gives us our little, I don't know, kidney bean type shape. I'm not sure how else I would call that, but yeah. And you can keep adding some more black if you want to refine that a little bit. Try not to get too picky. Be kind on yourself, especially if this is your first project. But yeah, that's how we're going to do our eyes. Go ahead and pause the video. I'll show you how I like to glue them in just a moment. So now I have both of my eye patches in. They're not completely symmetrical, in all honesty, and I am okay with that. You'd be surprised, like, we're all our worst critics, right? So there have been times where I've been working on something and I'm like, oh no, this is so noticeable. And then, you know, I put it out for sale and no one even, you know, bats an eye at the fact that, I don't know, this one's just a tiny bit lower than that one. But yeah, that's just part of the process. So we're going to want to glue these guys down, right? They're in there pretty sturdy, but if someone, you know, drops it on the floor, it might jar it enough. And your kit comes with glue, so you might as well use it. I'm not going to break this one open. It's still sealed, but you're probably familiar with this type of situation. The other end of the cap has a spike that you can puncture the glue with and use it just like that. The best glue, in my opinion, for attaching wool to something metallic like the eyes are. Well, rather, the post is metal and the eye is glass, so smooth materials. The best glue, in my opinion, is the E6000. And here I have an open tube of it there. And this is what I'm going to use. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this slightly out. I'm not going to pull them all the way out because then it might be hard to get them back in their little shafts, right, that we made with the red needle. And if you are using the little tiny tube, you'll open it up. And then go ahead and put a little bit on a piece of scrap paper. If you have no scrap paper, you could also just kind of put it on the lid of your box, right, that the kit came into. Whatever's handy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a little bit, just a tiny bit, up onto the tip of my needle here. And I'm going to go behind the eye, like so, poke down and push this in so that when I pull out, all the glue kind of stays down there and it doesn't get all stringy and messy everywhere. If you were to like pull out this post and dip it in the glue, you'll get little glue strings and they're not, I don't like them. I don't like the glue strings. So just to repeat, little dab of glue right behind the eye, kind of stab that in, push it down. That should take most of the glue off the needle, but if there's a little extra, just stab it a few times into your foam pad and that will pull off any extra glue that you have. And with that, we have ourselves a little panda bear. Congratulations, you did it! Thank you so much for trying out my kit. Hopefully there'll be a lot more in the future, but evidence has shown so far that I get maybe one of these done a year. And the donut kit is sold out right now. But anyways, thank you guys so much. Happy felting, and I'll see you around. Bye-bye.